When Taehyung confesses his secret lover on a live podcast, Jungkook's reaction stuns the world, unmasking betrayals, hidden desires, and explosive truths. "I'm not hiding it anymore, I have a lover." The words drop like a grenade in the dim podcast studio, slicing through silence with terrifying clarity. The host blinks frozen, fingers tightening around the table's edge. The live broadcast doesn't cut. It doesn't censor. Millions are watching. In the corner of the room, slumped into the leather couch, Jungkook slowly lifts his head, breath trembling under cold fluorescent lights. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights and raw from emotions unnamed, lock onto Taehyung. For 3 full seconds there is only silence, thick enough to vibrate, loud in its stillness. Then Jungkook stands. The chair screeches. It echoes louder than the confession. Taehyung doesn't look away. His voice was calm, too calm, and his eyes gleam with something unplaceable. Relief, rebellion, or the last splinter of a heart done pretending. Outside, soul pulses electric. Rain taps against studio glass, smearing city lights into swirling color, fitting for the storm inside. The host fumbles cue cards, but no one is listening. The world detonates online. Taehyung trends in under 30 seconds. Headlines ignite. Hashtags multiply like wildfire. But Jungkook hears none of it. His ears ring with memory, betrayal, and something far more dangerous, clarity. 2 hours earlier, Jungkook stared at his reflection backstage, rehearsing the smile that protected him for years. Taehyung wasn't scheduled to speak. He only came to support, or so he told himself. He didn't know Taehyung would talk, or maybe he did. Maybe that's the part that haunts him now, the quiet certainty he carried into a storm he still walked into. Years ago, Taehyung and Jungkook whispered a promise in stairwells and backstage shadows. "We protect this, no matter what." The vow returns like smoke. "You broke the silence now," Jungkook whispers, voice rough. "After everything." Taehyung finally looks at him, not apologetic, not afraid, just exhausted from dying quietly too long. "I protected it," he says, "until it started killing me." Producers wave frantically behind glass. Someone yells to cut to commercial. Too late, truth is out, irreversible. Phones buzz non-stop in another room where Taehyung left before recording. Namjoon, Jin, and Yoongi receive calls they cannot answer yet. HYBE executives scramble, unsure whether to stop the wreck or let it burn public. Jungkook's gaze flicks between Taehyung and the door, as if distance itself became a battlefield. "There's never a right time," Taehyung says, voice rising slightly now, calmer than his pulse. "Just the moment you decide you deserve air again." The crowd behind studio glass doesn't breathe. Even the host, sweating under lights, doesn't interrupt. This isn't drama, this is sacred rupture, a forbidden truth burned alive in real time. "You weren't supposed to fall in love," Jungkook whispers, voice cracking. "Not where they can touch it." Taehyung's eyes soften, but he doesn't retreat. "And you weren't supposed to leave me when it did." The blow isn't loud, no shouting, no chaos yet, just a wound reopened by honesty. Jungkook reels. "Say it," Taehyung says, voice trembling now. "Say you never loved me, I'll walk away." Jungkook can't answer. Not from refusal, but because deeper than survival walls is a truth worse than scandal. He still does, and it's killing him. "Say it, Jungkook," Taehyung urges, "or I swear I never look back again." The threat is real, razor-sharp with unshed years. Oxygen feels traitorous. Cameras don't know if this is still a podcast or live implosion of BTS legacy. Jungkook steps forward, breath mixing with his. "Don't make me the villain," he snaps, voice deep, gravel shaken. "You detonated this." Taehyung laughs, dry, exhausted. "Detonated. I buried it while you smiled like it never happened, like I was no one who kept you awake, no one whose hand you held when lights died." His voice breaks. Thunder quiet, across glass, producers stop moving. A sound tech freezes mid-knob. Jungkook turns to rain-smeared city outside. "You think I didn't drown in silence too?" he asks, quieter, more dangerous. "I memorized every scar while pretending blindness. I lied to protect you from wolves that eat idols who breathe wrong." Taehyung steps back. "I didn't need protection, I needed you." The words fall heavier than screams. Jungkook's phone buzzes. Board meeting alerts, legal flights, PR escalation threads forming, millions ready to love or rip them apart. But none louder than the truth he now cannot re-swallow. Jungkook looks at him, really looks. The world roars outside. Inside, love finally speaks before strategy can muzzle it again. The confession kept replaying in Jungkook's head, but the world outside moved faster than memory. Within minutes, comment sections split into two nations. One crowned Taehyung a tragic hero, finally choosing love over captivity. The other sharpened knives made of accusations, betrayal theories, and moral outrage. Jungkook could almost visualize the digital flames climbing higher with every refresh, but he stayed locked in the moment that mattered, the eye of the storm where Taehyung still stood breathing unevenly but refusing to collapse. The host attempted a recovery line, something about artistic vulnerability, something about emotional honesty in modern media, but his voice sounded distant, like someone speaking underwater. What was once a controlled narrative environment had mutated into a tribunal with no judge and no mercy. Taehyung didn't need theatrics to make it hurt. He just needed truth. Jungkook remembered how 2 hours before recording, Taehyung was humming backstage, not nervous, not shaking, but possessed by the eerie calm of someone who already made peace with the guillotine. Jungkook should have recognized it then. He should have seen that kind of serenity never precedes safety, only inevitability. But hindsight was a luxury panic never affords. The studio lights buzzed faintly overhead, adding a strange electricity to the tension, like the building itself anticipated impact. Jungkook exhaled slowly, attempting to ground himself, but his breath betrayed him, quivering just slightly at the edges. He hated how visible his emotions felt now. Not for the cameras, but for Taehyung. Because Taehyung always read him better than the world ever could. The producers still hadn't cut the feed. Not because they supported liberation, but because virality was a beast bigger than caution. They weren't storytellers anymore. They were spectators writing shock value into the history books. The microphones captured every inhale, every micro-expression, every shift in weight and heartbeat. The broadcast didn't feel produced anymore. It felt confiscated by destiny. "You really think this was easy for me?" Taehyung asked quietly, breaking the silence first this time, voice tired but sharpened by emotional dehydration. Jungkook's gaze flicked toward him instantly, like his name had been pulled by gravity. "You said it like you were done hurting," Jungkook replied. "Like you already won the fight." Taehyung shook his head slowly. "I didn't win anything. I just ran out of places to bleed in private." Jungkook hated how much he understood that sentence. He hated how long they both believed silence was synonymous with protection. Silence was never armor. It was anesthesia, temporary and poisonous if used too long. Jungkook thought of the nights after concerts where Taehyung sat too far from everyone else in hotel rooms, glowing only from the reflection of his phone, reading messages he never replied to, absorbing praise like punishment because it reminded him the world loved a version of him that wasn't allowed complexity. That version wasn't real. It was engineered to be consumed without resistance, and now the resistance had arrived, too late to negotiate. Jungkook remembered the vow again, not as romance but as a treaty, the kind signed in youth with no comprehension of the cost in adulthood, a treaty they both broke in different ways, Taehyung by speaking, Jungkook by waiting. "You could have told me," Jungkook said, voice tightening slightly, not accusing, just unraveling. Taehyung's eyes glistened under light. "You could have stopped me." "I would have prepared with you," Jungkook countered, "not stopped you." "You don't know that," Taehyung whispered. "I do," Jungkook replied, softer now, "because I've been preparing for this my whole life without admitting it." The host swallowed audibly, sensing the narrative shift, sensing this wasn't a scandal to moderate anymore, it was a confession to witness. And witnesses don't get speaking roles in revolutions. They get remembered or erased. Taehyung inhaled slowly, nodding once. "Then stand here now," he said. "Because I can't do the standing for both of us forever." Jungkook's pulse hammered against his ribs at that line, not from pressure but recognition. He stepped forward slightly, shoes scraping faintly against the studio floor, a small sound but seismic in implication. Because for the first time, movement replaced rehearsal. The world outside didn't know this choreography. It wasn't for them. It was for survival redefined, no longer idle survival but human survival. The kind where love and fear occupy the same bed but no longer the same prison cell. "You think the backlash is the war?" Jungkook asked, voice low, intimate but edged with steel. "The war was silence," Taehyung corrected. Backlash is just the battlefield they forced us onto. Jungkook nodded slowly, jaw tightening. The moment felt like stepping onto a minefield willingly because not stepping meant death guaranteed. He looked toward the cameras briefly, not performing, just acknowledging their existence like weather you cannot negotiate with. Then he looked back at Taehyung because the world was loud, but Taehyung was clarity, and clarity demanded loyalty, not perfection. If they want a villain, Jungkook said quietly, they'll have to split me in half to find one. Taehyung exhaled something between a laugh and a sob. They won't split you, he said. They'll just choose the easier narrative. Then we make the narrative harder, Jungkook replied. His voice cracked slightly at the end, but not from weakness, from the weight of finally using it. The host attempted another interjection, but Jungkook raised a hand gently, the universal symbol for pause, not production pause, existential pause. The kind that makes even executives listening from another floor feel irrelevant for a moment. Because love said publicly isn't a punctuation mark. It's a declaration of independence. And independence doesn't ask permission. It just happens, terrifying and irreversible. Jungkook remembered again how earlier that day, Taehyung brushed past him backstage and squeezed his shoulder once, a tiny gesture the cameras never caught, but his nervous system stored like scripture. Maybe Jungkook didn't know what Taehyung would say, but he always knew what Taehyung meant. The city outside glittered in rain and rumor, but inside the studio, rumor died and narrative began. And the narrative wasn't asking if the world was ready. The narrative was daring the world to react, and it already had. The moment the confession settled, not in resolution but in suspension, the studio felt like a room between lightning strikes. No thunder yet, but the static promised impact. Jungkook's silence was no longer absence of sound. It was a loaded chamber waiting for a reason. The host realized then that this broadcast had crossed a threshold where moderation was cosmetic and truth had seized the wheel. He glanced toward the small monitor displaying live metrics, viewers multiplying by the second, engagement surging in a way that resembled panic and worship fused together. This wasn't a rise. It was an exodus. Taehyung exhaled slowly, steadying his stance but not for optics. He steadied himself because collapse was no longer an option once you choose honesty in public. Jungkook finally met his eyes again, something fracturing internally, not heartbreak, but the infrastructure that once convinced him survival meant silence. Taehyung's voice, calm at the start, now carried the exhaustion of someone who had already mourned every possible outcome before speaking. Jungkook envied that kind of premature grief, not because it was noble but because it was preparation. Jungkook had prepared for applause, not truth, and truth required different muscles. He remembered nights spent backstage after award shows where Taehyung sat too still, eyes tracing the floor like he was memorizing escape routes that didn't exist. Jungkook always thought that posture was fatigue. Now he realized it was containment. Taehyung had been holding a storm with bare hands for years, while Jungkook was perfecting smiles like they were sandbags against a flood that had already breached the city. You really think they care why you said it? Jungkook asked quietly, voice low but resonant, intimate like a scar talking to its twin. Taehyung shook his head once. No, they care who they can blame for feeling something inconvenient. Jungkook nodded slowly. The silence felt like acknowledgement, like treaty renegotiated too late but still binding. The producers hovered behind glass, motionless now, like the room itself instructed them to stop moving because movement suggested control, and they had none. A revolution doesn't look rehearsed. It looks like this, breathing, trembling, human, irreversible. You know they'll make this about betrayal, Jungkook said again, jaw tightening slightly. Let them, Taehyung replied, voice rough. The betrayal was making us believe silence was love. The host swallowed hard, adjusting his headset as if that could anchor him, but anchors don't work in storms built from truth. They work only in oceans that agree to behave. This ocean refused. Jungkook glanced briefly toward the cameras, not performing, just registering their presence like you register weather, unavoidable but not personal. The broadcast feed kept rolling, not from intent but momentum. Intent had died earlier. Momentum was the new curator. Taehyung's confession had cracked a dam. Jungkook's reaction would determine whether the crack became a rupture or a grave. "You don't get to vanish after this," Jungkook murmured, quieter now, sadness dissolving into something heavier, accountability. "Not for them," Taehyung corrected. "For us." Jungkook's breath hitched faintly, a microfracture audible only because the room had stopped breathing. "Then what do you want?" Jungkook asked, voice cracking at the edges. "To stop dying quietly," Taehyung said. "To stand where I'm not edited out of the frame of my own life." Jungkook hated how much he understood that line. Because understanding meant culpability shared, not avoided. The host looked toward them again, realizing this wasn't a press beat or fandom drama. This was intergroup truth weaponized by oxygen deprivation and emotional starvation. A war about presence, not publicity. The world outside was loud. Inside, loudness was memory. Presence was revolution. "You kiss me like it was the end," Jungkook whispered, eyes narrowing, voice trembling but not hostile, just unfiltered. "I kissed you like I was drowning," Taehyung corrected, stepping slightly closer, shoes scraping again, seismic in implication because sound in silence is magnitude. "And you didn't pull away." Jungkook exhaled sharply. "I thought pulling away was protection." Taehyung's eyes softened but didn't retreat. "Protection without presence is abandonment with good PR." The host froze again, sweat tracing his temple. He wanted to interrupt, but interruption is a luxury only afforded to those who believe they own narrative packing. He didn't. Taehyung continued, voice lower but edged like a truth long rehearsed in mirror reflections. "I said it because silence was suffocating me, but I meant it because suffocation clarified who mattered." Jungkook nodded once, jaw tightening like someone deciding between detonation and surrender. The moment didn't feel like produced drama anymore. It felt confiscated by inevitability and reframed by adulthood. "If the world wants villains," Jungkook said quietly, voice thick with emotional gravel, "they'll have to indict me too. Because I stayed silent, not because I stopped loving you, but because I was terrified of how much I did." The room stopped breathing again, not from shock but recognition. Because recognition is the moment fandom becomes human, and human stories don't ask permission. They rewrite industries without meetings, without clauses, without mercy. The internet wasn't ready. BTS wasn't prepared. But two men were done rehearsing survival and had finally chosen presence over choreography. And presence, once chosen, never retreats quietly. The world outside the studio was no longer reacting. It was rewriting itself in real time. Every fandom faction had become a live wire, sparking debates that felt less like commentary and more like identity warfare. But inside the sealed studio corridor, the war was different. It wasn't digital. It was anatomical. Jungkook's heart rate spiked not from public pressure, but from the immediacy of Taehyung standing close enough that the air between them had become a shared sentence neither could edit anymore. The host tried again, desperate for structure, but structure belongs to those who still believe narrative can be paused without consequence. This narrative had emancipated itself from permission. Taehyung's confession had moved past romance and crossed into sovereignty. Jungkook remembered how earlier that night he had laughed at something trivial backstage, an inside joke about choreography timing, and Taehyung had smiled, small, almost invisible. That smallness wasn't shyness. It was rationing emotional expression to survive an industry allergic to nuance. Jungkook hated that he hadn't seen it then. He had been rehearsing the wrong emotions, preparing smiles when he should have been preparing honesty. Honesty didn't ask for vocal training. It asked for consequence tolerance. "You think I wanted spectators?" Taehyung asked quietly, voice lower but lethal in sincerity, like someone who already counted every exit and found none worth taking without speaking first. "No," Jungkook replied, jaw tightening. "I think you wanted acknowledgement without negotiation." Taehyung exhaled, nodding slowly. The nod carried years, the kind of temporal weight no camera can quantify but every nervous system recognizes. The producers were silent behind the glass booth now, because silence in a revolution isn't absence. It's deference. Taehyung's voice had been soft earlier. Now it carried a rasp of someone who had been speaking through emotional dehydration for years. "You know they'll make this about image fracture," Jungkook murmured, glancing at the mic clipped to Taehyung's shirt like it was evidence of a crime no longer prosecutable because the statute of limitations had been obliterated by honesty. "Image already fractured," Taehyung said. "We're just nomming the fracture line." Jungkook nodded once. The nod was not agreement for public consumption. It was agreement for survival renegotiated by adulthood, no longer idle survival but organismal survival. "Then stand in the fracture with me now," Taehyung whispered. Jungkook took a breath that shuddered once twice, but he didn't move away. Movement away suggests narrative cowardice. Staying still suggests narrative ownership. He stepped forward instead, shoes scraping the floor again like seismic punctuation. "You don't get to disappear after this," he said, quieter but heavier now. "Not for them, for us." Taehyung met his gaze again, rain tracing lines down the studio glass behind them like calligraphy for the emotional weather inside. "I didn't confess for nobility," Taehyung said. "I confessed because oxygen felt traitorous every time I rehearsed silence next to you." Jungkook hated how much he understood that. Understanding meant culpability shared, not avoided. "I thought silence was armor," Jungkook said, voice cracking slightly at the edges. "Silence was anesthesia," Taehyung corrected. "Temporary, poisonous if used too long." The host looked toward them again, realizing this wasn't press beat or fandom drama. This was truth occupying public infrastructure. The broadcast feed kept rolling, not from intent but momentum. Intent had died earlier. Momentum was the curator now. "You really think the world will spare nuance?" Jungkook asked. Taehyung shook his head. "Spare? No, but they'll choke on complexity if we finally serve it without garnish." Jungkook allowed the faintest laugh, humorless but not hopeless, like someone whose emotional vocabulary was finally learning a new dialect. "Then let them choke," he whispered, stepping closer. "Because I've been choking on silence too long to blame you for wanting air." Taehyung blinked once, stunned not by the words but by the fact Jungkook finally used them out loud. Moment felt confiscated by inevitability. "If they want villains," Jungkook said quietly, "they'll have to split us both to find one." Taehyung exhaled something between a sob and a laugh. "They won't split you, they'll choose the easier narrative." "Then we make the narrative harder," Jungkook replied. His voice cracked at the end, but not from weakness, from finally using it. The producers waved frantically behind glass. Someone shouted about cutting to commercial. Too late, truth was out. Irreversible. And truth publicly stated doesn't retreat quietly, not even for commercial breaks. Jungkook reached slightly toward Taehyung's wrist, stopping just before touch like someone asking permission for a boundary that no longer existed. Permission was the language of yesterday. Presence was the grammar of now. Taehyung's confession had already crossed into a territory where protection without presence is abandonment with better lighting. "Then stay," Taehyung whispered, voice cracking. "Stay where the cameras can't script our pulse anymore." Jungkook finally reached, brushing Taehyung's wrist once, small but volcanic. No camera caught it, but the room felt it anyway. The internet roared outside. Inside, love finally stopped rehearsing survival and chose presence instead. And presence, once chosen, never retreats quietly. The room had shifted, not emotionally, structurally. Truth changes architecture before it changes hearts. The studio, once a set designed for dialogue, had become a courtroom with no judge, no jury, and no plea deals. Jungkook and Taehyung were no longer participants in a broadcast. They were exhibits of emotional inevitability. Outside, clips of the confession were being dissected into micro-moments, framed, cropped, captioned, miscaptioned, weaponized, memed, mourned, and worshipped. But inside the room where the original sound was born, the stakes were different. It wasn't about being heard. It was about not disappearing in the presence of someone who already memorized the shape of your silence. Jungkook's thumb hovered near Taehyung's wrist again, not reaching, just acknowledging gravitational pull. Taehyung didn't look down. Looking down suggests hesitation. Hesitation suggests regret. He had no regret left to spare. Regret had been prepaid in private for years. This moment was cash only in honesty. The host had stopped pretending to mediate. Mediation is for conflicts still undecided. This conflict had decided itself out loud. Producers behind glass whispered about pivoting the narrative toward something digestible, sponsor-friendly, image-neutral. But neutrality is dead once honesty takes center stage. Honesty doesn't audition for sponsors. Sponsors audition for honesty retroactively. Hopping the public forgives opportunism when it's coated in empathy. "You really believe love survives compression?" Jungkook asked quietly, voice gravel-low like emotional erosion had been sandblasting his throat for years. "Compression was killing it," Taehyung replied. "I'm just resuscitating it with air." The host swallowed again, realizing this wasn't scandal or romance. This was CPR performed on identity. Jungkook exhaled slowly, nodding like someone finally agreeing that oxygen is a human right, not a marketing strategy. The confession was still echoing in global feeds, but its echo had mutated into narratives Taehyung never authored. He never planned authorship. He planned exhalation. "I didn't say it to be understood," Taehyung continued, voice steady again, but with the tremor of someone balancing a revolution on cartilage and courage. "I said it to stop being interpreted through silence." Jungkook's jaw flexed once, twice. Flexing is emotional grammar for someone translating shock into cognition. "Then let them misinterpret," Jungkook said. "Misinterpretation still means we existed in the sentence." Taehyung allowed the faintest smile, but it wasn't relief. It was resignation to consequence, the kind that feels adult, not tragic. "They'll demand villains," Taehyung said again, eyes flicking toward the camera rig still blinking red, machines faithfully recording momentum they no longer controlled. "Villains require distance," Jungkook countered. "We're standing too close for that." The host realized then why this broadcast was uncontainable. Not because it was dramatic, but because it refused emotional distancing, refused villain manufacturing by proximity collapse. The internet loves binaries, lover or traitor, silent or savage, angel or antagonist, devotion or betrayal. But humans contain multitudes the internet can't buffer without lag. Taehyung had finally chosen to transmit at full resolution. No compression, no subtitles for his pulse. "Then we stand in the multitudes," Jungkook whispered again, stepping microscopically closer, not to perform but to acknowledge that love in public becomes a public utility everyone tries to privatize retroactively. The host cleared his throat, finally finding his voice not to interrupt but to document. "For anyone watching," he said, "this isn't a love triangle, this is a love testimony." It was the closest anyone came to framing the moment without flattening it. Producers stopped moving. Moving suggests damage control. There was no damage left to control, only aftermath to survive. Jungkook glanced once more toward the mic clipped on Taehyung's shirt. "If love needed secrecy to live," he said, "it was already dying before you confessed." Taehyung inhaled sharply. Inhale is punctuation for someone recognizing shared culpability. "I confessed," Taehyung said, "because the world kept narrating my silence louder than my existence." Jungkook finally brushed Taehyung's wrist again. Brief, unproduced, unchoreographed, non-symbolic, human, irreversible. The moment lasted less than a second. Less than a second is still eternity when done out loud after years of silence rehearsal. No camera zoomed. No editor framed it. But every nervous system in the room felt the microseismic shift anyway. Because presence, once chosen, rewrites atmospheres without press releases. The confession had now aged past its ignition point and entered the era of consequences. Not consequences for headlines, consequences for the nervous system, for the bones, for the air molecules still vibrating with a truth spoken without rehearsal filters. The studio lights felt harsher now, not because brightness changed, but because honesty makes illumination feel like interrogation. Jungkook wasn't intimidated by light. He was intimidated by how light revealed the truth that silence had been his longest contract, signed without consent and renewed by fear. Taehyung stood still again, but this stillness was different from the one Jungkook once misunderstood. This wasn't containment. This was occupation, claiming a moment that no fandom faction, producer panel, or social algorithm could repossess without distorting it first. "They'll dig into the timeline," Jungkook said quietly, voice low but not wavering anymore. "They'll look for the first crack." "Let them," Taehyung replied. The first crack was us being told that love had to sound marketable to be real. The host shifted in his seat, finally realizing that viral moments are not born from volume but from emotional scarcity breaking into emotional surplus. Scarcity had been the norm for idols trained to ration vulnerability like it was a limited edition album drop. But this drop wasn't limited. It was permanent. Jungkook remembered the first year they debuted, how Taehyung talked about loneliness like it was weather, casual, unpoetic, unscripted. Jungkook thought it was dramatization then. Now he realized it was meteorology. Taehyung had been forecasting internal storms no one bothered to track until the damage hit the coast. "They'll ask who you were protecting," Jungkook said again. "No one," Taehyung answered. "I was protecting the idea of us, not the reality. The reality needed air, not armor." Jungkook nodded slowly, the nod of someone realizing oxygen was overdue payment. "Then what now?" Jungkook asked. "Now," Taehyung said, "we survive where silence can't subtitle us anymore." Producers behind glass finally sat down, not out of agreement but exhaustion. Exhaustion is truth's favorite accomplice. Truth waits until fatigue disarms performance muscles. The host looked at the small monitor again, CTR climbing, engagement peaking like emotional altitude sickness. SEO didn't need to be forced anymore. The moment itself had become the keyword. Jungkook's voice dropped again, softer now but edged like someone filing truth in real time. "You said lover, but you meant liberation." Taehyung blinked once, slow, deliberate. "I meant both. Love without liberation is hostage with better lighting." Jungkook hated how clean that truth felt, because clean truths are the hardest to debate against. "They'll try to turn this into betrayal lore," Jungkook said again. "Lore requires mystery," Taehyung countered. "I removed the mystery. All they have left is truth they can't comfortably own." The host realized then why the room felt irreversible. Reversibility requires ambiguity. Ambiguity had left the building the moment Taehyung spoke without garnish. Jungkook took another breath, steadier now, but with the weight of someone finally agreeing that survival meant presence, not choreography. "Then we don't hand them distance," Jungkook said. "Distance is where narratives murder nuance." Taehyung nodded. "Nuance doesn't trend," he said, "but it survives longer than binaries." The host exhaled too, quietly but loud enough for microphones to register human respiration, not curated emotion. "For anyone watching," he said again, "this is not damage to BTS. This is adulthood arriving without subtitles." Producers didn't interrupt. Interruption is a luxury only afforded when truth still fears packing. Truth no longer feared packing. It feared disappearance. And disappearance had finally been vetoed by presence. Jungkook brushed Taehyung's wrist again, not symbolic anymore, just anatomical truth acknowledging another anatomical truth. No cameras zoomed. No editor framed it. But atmospheres register presence faster than algorithms. Outside, the world kept roaring. Inside, love had finally chosen full resolution. And full resolution truths never negotiate compression again. The confession was no longer a moment. It had become an atmosphere, a weather system settling over everything BTS had ever built, not to destroy it, but to expose the scaffolding that once relied on emotional minimalism to survive fame's appetite. Jungkook could feel the shift in his pulse. His heartbeat wasn't racing for the cameras anymore. It was racing to keep him inside the frame of his own life, a frame he had almost surrendered to silence years ago. Taehyung's calmness now had texture. It had edges. Calmness without edges is sedation. Calmness with edges is decision. "They'll ask when you realized you had a lover," Jungkook said quietly, but his voice carried something new now, curiosity without accusation, a dialect of honesty he was still learning to speak. Taehyung didn't rush his answer. Rushed honesty is panic. Slow honesty is ownership. "I realized I had a lover when loneliness stopped feeling poetic and started feeling like eviction," Taehyung said, eyes steady. "Not eviction from the world, eviction from myself." The host behind the table exhaled again, quieter now, because he finally understood this was not a broadcast to manage. This was a broadcast to witness. Witnessing doesn't need modulation. It needs presence. Jungkook leaned back slightly, not retreating, just absorbing like someone letting truth soak into muscle tissue instead of deflecting it. And Jungkook, the host asked, careful not to flatten the moment into spectacle. What went through your head when you heard it? Jungkook didn't look at the monitor showing global uproar. He didn't look at the producers behind glass. He looked at Taehyung because eye contact is the shortest legal document when truth is involved. What went through my head? Jungkook repeated, voice lower. The fact that he said it out loud before any of us suffocated to death quietly. Taehyung blinked again, recognizing the weight of that admission. Jungkook continued, not dramatic, just precise, like someone calibrating emotional instruments for the first time. I wasn't shocked by the lover part. I was shocked by the breathing part, the exhale, the permission to finally exist audibly. The host nodded slowly. That's the part that shook the room, he said. Not romance, respiration. Outside, fan edits were trying to assign motive like detectives allergic to complexity. But motive in honesty is not a single arrow. It's a compass that finally stopped spinning. They'll ask who the lover is, Jungkook said again, not bothered by the question itself but by its inevitability. Names are handles for narratives, Taehyung replied. And narratives love handles more than they love people. Jungkook allowed a faint smile again, tiny, but real, like someone stretching emotional muscles that had atrophied from public silence dieting. The host adjusted his headset again, not from panic anymore, but ritual. The public won't let this stay shapeless, he said. They'll sculpt it, Taehyung nodded. Sculpture is fine, as long as the clay is mine first. Jungkook added quietly, and as long as they don't amputate nuance to make it trendable. The host looked directly at the camera then, voice steady now, as if the room itself granted him narrative citizenship. For anyone watching, fandom included, he said clearly, love is not the headline here. Honesty is the infrastructure. Romance is just the decoration that refused compression. Jungkook shifted again, leaning forward this time, not rehearsed, not produced, not optimized for RPM metrics, just optimized for presence, the kind that survives misinterpretation. If the world wants a timeline, Jungkook said, let it begin tonight, because tonight is the first time we stop disappearing in the middle of the sentence. Taehyung nodded, faint but tectonic in implication, because some nods are punctuation, some nods are contracts, and this one was emancipation. Outside, the world kept roaring in binary hashtags. Inside, truth kept breathing at full resolution, refusing compression not with rebellion but with calm adulthood.